The state of hacking before the Apple II was very limited. You couldn't go sit in your bedroom and start playing with computer networks. The Apple II made everything take off. We started forming these different gangs. The Apple Mafia, the Knights of Shadow, the Legion of Doom, elite hackers of the time. We could control phone systems, credit card fraud, trade software, crack software. Piracy was a huge part of what made the Apple II popular. It was kind of like this alternate universe that nobody else really knew about. That completely meshed with the counterculture. The Apple II's legacy for hacking was the creation of this entire culture which still exists today. This was actually a thing that a bunch of things were finished on, written on, worked on. Oh my God, this is bad for a variety of reasons. I'm not entirely clear that it is going to work.
There's only one way to find out.
Yeah, there is. The most expensive thing on earth is freedom. I'm kind of allergic to being told what to do. This is the box that contains the universal fulcrum that kind of changed everything for me. Right there is a monitor. Underneath this are drives and an Apple II. My name is Patrick Kroupa. My handle in the underground originally was Lord Digital. My introduction to technology was I was spending time with my dad in Colorado, who was working for this thing called NCAR, which is the National Center for Atmospheric Research. They had one of the first 2 Cray supercomputers that had ever been built. It was like a religious experience walking in there. My father recognized that computers were a good thing to fill my head with, and I wanted to get a computer of my own, and the Apple II had just been released.
Using an Apple II is very easy. The only hard part is getting your kid away from it. Get him an Apple of his own.
The state of hacking before the Apple II, prior to that, you would have to be a student at an academic institution. You would have to be an employee of the government, in some manner have access to a mainframe and a terminal. You couldn't go sit in your bedroom and start playing with computer networks. The Apple II essentially changed the entire industry because it created the computer industry. The whole history of Apple started with the blue box. Steve Wozniak was a brilliant engineer, and making a blue box is kind of like a joke for somebody who's designing computers. They made circuit boards, and it had a couple of buttons on it, and they basically emitted a couple of tones. This is phone freaking. The whole Captain Crunch thing with the whistle that he found in the cereal box that happened to go at 2600 hertz. The frequency that basically will trunk a phone line. Essentially, it allowed you to become an operator. Technically, you're committing a series of felonies.
And these were illegal, I have to add. But in spite of that, we were so fascinated by them that Woz and I actually figured out how to build one. We built the best one in the world. It was the first digital blue box in the world.
And they used the funding to enable Apple Computer to move forward in the very early days. The Apple I sold for $666. It was a circuit board, and you basically had to add everything else to it. It wasn't really much of a finished product. It was more a proof of concept.
In the early days of computers, we put out a very basic computer. It was just a raw little board with 4K of memory and a microprocessor, and it had a bunch of slots, but it couldn't do anything.
It wasn't something you could pull out of a box and plug into the wall and it would work. You had to put in some effort to make that happen. What the Apple II changed in terms of hacking was it gave you tremendous power in your house, in your room if you're a kid. You basically had a box. It was a computer inside of it. You could pull it out of the box and it worked. Having that and the ability to play with it and explore was amazing.
My dream for the Apple II was to sell the first real packaged computer.
packaged personal computer, where you didn't have to be a hardware hobbyist at all.
All right, so static-proof bags. This is the Apple Cat. The Apple Cat is extremely rare. There's probably a couple hundred left on Earth that still work. Oh, drugs from 40 years ago. No, a joystick. You can play Wolfenstein with a joystick. This is it. This is an Apple II. Let me get some of the wrapping off of it. Oh my God, this is the original Apple IIe, which is bad for a variety of reasons because it's the one with the smash keyboard. It's missing a few keys. Yeah. It had a keyboard and had the ability to attach a monitor so that you could, see what's happening with it. Woz had not yet invented the 5.25-inch floppy drive, which revolutionized everything yet again. That was a bit later. You loaded programs on cassette tape, and it was very, very slow, although at the time, nobody really knew that. It was just like, wow, it's amazing. It's doing something. Either it will turn on, it won't turn on, or it will burst into flames. Hopefully not the third one.
I couldn't tell if you were being funny or not. That's an actual possibility. It could light on fire.
Yeah. It could. Yeah, no, it's not powering up because there will be an Apple II right there just off the firmware. The monitor's powering up. Yeah, no, I would have to swap out a lot of different things to make this one go. Apologies. Unfortunately, that's it. Dun, dun, dun. It didn't really have anything that would be considered amazing at this point in time. I mean, the initial memory was ridiculously small, 48K RAM, but you could expand it to 64K, which was way better. What made the Apple II super cool was the fact that it came with a bunch of slots. You could insert cards, and the cards are pieces of hardware which would fundamentally change how the computer worked. These are all the slots. This one right here is full. This looks like a extended 80-column card. So it increased the resolution from 40 columns to 80 columns, which was just staggering back then. And it doubled the RAM from 64K to 128K. I had this thing completely filled up because I was using every single slot on this thing. If you're interested in hacking, you could run CP/M on it. Multiple operating systems on it. You could do things like insert the Apple Cat modem into the slots, which is not something Apple was thinking of at the time they made it. This is the primary card right here, the Apple Cat. The greatest modem that ever existed for the Apple II. You had very high-speed transfers, you had complete compatibility with all the world's standard 212 protocols with that card. You had control of the entire Apple IIe system from another computer. Not an incredibly popular item in the 1980s because it was ridiculously overpriced and probably cost about as much as the computer did back then. I believe it was like $1,500 to $2K for all this stuff. It enabled piracy to occur, the mass distribution of software. Sharing games, sharing programs, transferring data, the same thing that occurs right now. Everything has to be better and faster and more and have lower latency. If you were a hacker in the early 80s, then this rocked. This is what you wanted to have. I mean, you could use this thing once you had a modem to kind of like reach out, access much larger computers all over the place. And at the time, Ward Christensen and Randy Suze invented the very first DBS system, which was just called bulletin board software, based on the concept of a bulletin board where people would go put up notices and whatever, except there were messages that you could share with one another. But it connected people from all over the world who had the same kind of interests and headspace, and suddenly you weren't one person who's isolated or talking to grown-ups about tech. You had a peer group. And this was the first time in history that this peer group had existed. How I sort of entered into the culture in a much bigger way was I was living in New York City. At that time, I was about 12, 13 years old, and New York City had these things called tap meetings in different diners on the Lower East Side. Tap started as YIPL, which was Youth International Party Lines. Then it metamorphosed a couple of times, and they settled on the name Technological Assistance Program. Abby Hoffman was one of the people responsible. I showed up at TAP because there were supposed to be these hacker meetings. These were friends of mine from BBSs, and like we'd go there, and it's like, this is completely filled with a lot of really weird grown-ups. And they keep rambling about politics and all this stuff that no one understands or really cares about. We wanted to talk about technology.
How the government is going to be brought down or lost in the shuffle, as we tend to put it. Our motto is, ask not what you can do for your country, but what your country can do for you.
What we discovered really fast is they really wanted to talk to us because they were fascinated about how to exploit technology to up the system, man, and take it over and cause problems. The understanding that there's nothing wrong with drugs was very prevalent there. It was like an entire peer group of people who loved technology and drugs and kind of intermixed that. That's the other thing. That's where you started kind of forming these cliques and gangs, and because you don't really have a family, so you create artificial families. I believe the first pirate group I was in was called the Apple Mafia. A bunch of kids who were approximately 12, 13 years old, and it was a computer conference on the East Coast, and it's like, hey, let's trade software, let's crack software. If you're a kid, are you gonna go and buy all these programs? No, you're not. And the ability to crack the software, throw up a title page, which is like tagging up your handle and your group on it, and then releasing it. And then it's a 0-day wear, which is like, status, and you become elite. And all of this is really silly in retrospect, but again, you have to keep in mind, everyone was like 12 to 15 to 16. The groups that were coming together, they were becoming more serious. That gave birth to a group called the Knights of Shadow. Elite hackers of the time. We could control phone systems. The phone system, Bell Labs, which became AT&T, that was the birth of all this stuff. They repeatedly made this statement that they don't listen to people's phone lines. They in fact don't have the technology to do that. Yeah, they do. It's a feature that's built into your operating system that you're saying doesn't exist, but it's right there. So you can basically pick any individual that you wanted, and you could intercept their phone calls and see what they had to say about things. And some of them are in politics right now, and so I don't want to point a gun at myself. It's just like, no, thank you. Going back to pranks and what's funny, you can also turn someone's phone into a payphone. So it's really hard to insert quarters into your regular phone. It's like, what the hell just happened here? There was a tremendous amount of carding. Carding was credit card fraud.
If it involves money in any way at all, it is predictable that crooks and thieves will be drawn to it like cats to sardines. And since credit cards are about money, stealing, faking, and forging them is now a small industry.
TRW very much made the statement that your credit card information was never contained online, except they lied. It was, and it was in an encrypted format, except the encrypted format was like Rodel 13, which is like rotate left 13. So it's like, okay, well, if you can't afford this $20,000 worth of hardware, you can just make it arrive, and no one has to pay for it at the end except some insurance company eats it, whatever. You're not really thinking about that, which inevitably is what made the early groups kind of self-destruct. The Legion of Doom was a little bit different. Okay, we're going to explore, we're going to own these different phone systems and computers and things like that, but the concept was really do no harm. What it did that was positive was it shared a lot of this information in the Legion of Doom technical journals to teach the next generation of people different techniques. How would you access different computer systems? What would you do once you're inside of them? Where did you get all of this information about how these systems work? In terms of the phone system, a lot of the time these were not available to the public, but you'd go dumpster diving because they regularly just threw them in the garbage and got new ones for the next year. I did a series of hacking programs that culminated in something called Phantom Access. It was a toolkit for the AppleCap that modem. Every other hacker that had ever existed was very limited. It's like it did a series of specific functions. Mine allowed you to do anything that you wanted to do. Without understanding how to program the AppleCat or the Apple, you basically gave it a really simple series of commands that could be likened to macros or just scripting. It was just a very cool, universal kind of tool for the Apple II. Also, we had this thing called festering hate. What it would do is take the read-write head of the disk, drop it on the floppy, and just write random garbage all over it, which made it relatively impossible to recover in about 2 seconds. This is actually before it was even against the law to write a computer virus. All of this was very much at the cusp of the computer revolution, if you want to call it that. You can use the term teenage boy and sociopath, and they're kind of interchangeable. Technically, you're committing crimes every day. People kind of like diverge sideways into fraud.
Search warrants are going out here in Chicago and a dozen other cities coast to coast in an effort to stop computer fraud that is costing companies and consumers millions of dollars.
Operation Sundevil was essentially the government waking up and realizing that a bunch of kids are running around causing problems and becoming hysterical and going on a witch hunt. They busted a lot of people just to demonstrate they could do that. The Secret Service, the FBI, they would kick in people's doors, they would confiscate your hardware, they would take all your things, they'd terrorize your parents, they'd show up with guns. Then they had 7 years to build a case against you.
Police confiscated 42 computer terminals, 23,000 computer disks, and reams of documents as evidence. They hope to use it to win indictments against members of the computer hacking ring.
You know, most of the time they never pursued any of those cases, and all that happened was 7 years later, you got back a bunch of cardboard boxes with computer equipment sitting inside of it that had been trashed. It was basically to harass the out of people, make them understand the government knows what's up with you. That was the entire purpose of Operation Sundevil. The Apple II's legacy for hacking was just the creation of this entire culture which still exists today. Steve Jobs was kicked out of Apple. He started Next. Next made really brilliant software and incredibly overpriced machines, which did not sell a lot of units. Next basically did a reverse takeover of Apple, which was 90 days away from bankruptcy when Steve Jobs came back. He essentially created the greatest second coming in the history of business. All of it has its genesis with the Apple II. Someone I used to trade wares with, who was very much part of the Apple II pirate scene in the early days, is Bruce Fancher. And where he ended up was being an engineer at Apple. He actually ended up convincing Steve Jobs to do the App Store. That came from him. And the App Store came from wares boards on BBSs, because you used to have these lists. Wouldn't it be cool if you could just like download everything brand new and just hit a button and do that? A lot of the transfer protocols, a lot of what commercial entities adopted later in time were actually creations of a bunch of kids who were just doing clever hacks and doing things. This film called Hackers, which came out because this guy named Raphael Moreau started interviewing a bunch of us. David Buchwald was like part of the consultants who made it into the credits, who stayed with it. A lot of us morphed into various characters that became that movie.
Hack the planet! For those late night hacking.
The DNA of the Apple II is present in pretty much everything. It's the computer that could.